Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Melinda Lang. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a senior curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum. This event is being live captioned. If you'd like to enable the captioning feature, please click on the transcript option in the bar below. And thank you to Morgan Pate for the live captioning. I'm thrilled to introduce our program this evening, Red Exit Andrea Carlson, in conversation with Santiago X, which is organized in conjunction with Carlson's current public art installation at the Whitney, titled Andrea Carlson, Red Exit. Here you're seeing her amazing work at the Whitney, Red Exit. I had the honor and immense pleasure of working closely with Andrea on this project over the past year. Red Exit is a new multi-part work on paper. It's quite ambitious in scale and in terms of the exquisite detail and complexity, as you can see here in this install image. At the Whitney, Carlson has reimagined the work in the form of a 17 by 29 foot vinyl print installed on the facade of 95 Horatio Street, across from the museum in the High Line. It is part of a series of public art installations begun in 2015 and organized by the Whitney in partnership with TF Cornerstone and High Line Art. At a time when our experience with public spaces have been reshaped, really transformed, Carlson's work points to the significance of landscape, belonging, and place. In Red Exit, Carlson is also thinking about themes of rebirth and renewal. And tonight you'll hear more about the multiple layers of symbolism in this work and how she uses those motifs to consider new narratives of Indigenous experience. As a side note, we're also very excited this incredible work, Red Exit, will join the Whitney's collection, thanks to our Drawing and Print Acquisition Committee. For tonight's program, Carlson has invited the artist Santiago X to speak with her about how their respective practices reclaim a past, present, and future that is often overlooked or rendered invisible. Through their distinct works, they reframe dominant narratives around Westernization to center Indigenous spaces and histories, reflect on and interrogate the legacy of colonial suppression, and imagine possibilities for the future. In both of their practices, they reference and are inspired by their ancestral homes and the Indigenous lands, now known geopolitically as the United States, which was built on and continues to represent unceded Indigenous territories. I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you tonight from the ancestral lands of the Canarsie and Munsee Lenape, otherwise known today as Brooklyn. I encourage everyone to take a moment to recognize the Indigenous people with ancestral ties to the land where you are joining us tonight, where you're joining us from. I also want to acknowledge the trauma and violence of our colonial legacies and their continued impact on Indigenous people today. I would like to express my solidarity with the communities and individuals who have suffered and continue to suffer as a consequence of settler colonialism and white supremacy. Following this week's conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, we are reminded of the urgent need for structural change and the work that's still ahead of us. Tonight's program will begin with Acknowledgement, a video by Santiago X, which features Carlson's voice and Ojibwe. This piece will help frame the conversation between Carlson and X about their shared interests in land as they take a close look at the landscape of Carlson's work, Red Exit. Both artists live in what is today known as Chicago, and their discussion will also touch on their relationships with the city, as well as the interconnections between their independent explorations of Native histories and spaces that have been obscured and erased, including examples such as the effigy mounds throughout the Midwest. Other topics that will come up include their interests in ideas of recreation, the reclamation of Native advocacy and identity, and how their practices celebrate the spaces Indigenous peoples reserve for themselves. So in just a moment, I'll introduce the artists and provide a little bit of background for you. It's really like such an honor, I must say, to introduce both Andrea Carlson and Santiago X. I'm so happy that they're here. Alongside her works on paper, Carlson produces multidisciplinary projects and writes cultural criticism. She's Grand Portage Ojibwe and grew up in Minnesota, While she is now based in Chicago, she has deep ties to her former home of Minneapolis. Carlson holds an MFA from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design and a BA from the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis. Her work is currently on view in Don't Let This Be Easy at the Walker Art Center. And in just a few days, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, will install her monumental work, Ink Babel, a companion piece to Red Exit. Her project at the Whitney, Andrea Carlson Red Exit, will be on view through September 2021. Santiago X is an Indigenous futurist, multidisciplinary artist, and architect specializing in land, architectural, and new media installation. X received a BA in environmental design from the University of Colorado, a Master's of Architecture from the University of Southern California, and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in Art and Technology. He's an enrolled citizen of the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana and Indigenous Chamorro from the island of Guam. His works are currently on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and the WNDR Museum. X's upcoming large-scale permanent earthwork, The Coiled Serpent, will debut in Chicago later this year, alongside his augmented reality application and development entitled Augmented Earth. His debut solo exhibition, Vision/Voids, will open at Space P11 on June 2nd. Andrea and X are longtime friends and collaborators, and I'm very excited that they are here with us tonight and really looking forward to hearing from both of them and having them in conversation. So in a moment, I'll hand it over to them. I just want to share kind of the structure of the program. Following their conversation, which will last about 40 minutes, I will come back to ask them a few questions and also pose a selection of questions from the audience. I encourage you to send us your questions during the program or after as we begin the Q&A. And if you'd like to do so, please use that Q&A feature that you see at the bottom of the menu bar. You can click on that icon and submit those questions anytime. Thank you again, all of you, so much for being here tonight and for tuning in. I'd also like to express my deepest gratitude to Andrea Carlson and Santiago X for their inspiring work and for spending some time with us this evening. We'll now start with Santiago X's video acknowledgement, which recognizes the Indigenous lands now known as Chicago.
Anin kinoa Anishinabedok Minoa Nindanoe Makanidok Nungum Sakogina Wind Kidayayang Padawadamia King Geget Bijnago Minoa Kakike Ayayang Apne Padawadamia King Shikagong Niswe Ishkode Zakaswe Iwidiwen Ojibwe Odawa Padawadami Kanakwe Skoda Dewang Chicago Minoa Bakang Kite Odinong Geget Bakan Nishnabek Dashmaya Kiam Nishnabek Miami Ho-Chunk Menominee Peoria Gorje Yang Oma Miigwech.
Krishna Kihani.
I hope everyone can hear me.
Hey, Andrea.
Oh, there you are. I don't see myself, so hopefully you can see me.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. Obuju ginawa Andrea Nindigenakas kagiasagik minawa mikanak nindodame Chicago nindunjaba idash Grant Murray ninda yang oma nungum miigwech. Thank you, Santiago X, for joining me. I'm currently up in Grand Marais, Minnesota, and I'm Turtle Clan, and I'm Grand Portage Ojibwe, as has been explained. And I just want to reiterate what Melinda said about just what an extraordinary, I'm just so very happy to be able to speak to Santiago X today. And I've been given an incredible gift with this space that the Whitney Museum has provided. And Melinda has been just an absolute pleasure to work with over the last year. She has had to kind of step in and be a therapist at times. So I definitely appreciate that. So we're here to talk about Red Exit, this piece that was made during quarantine, that I painted in 60 cells during a pandemic on my living room floor in pieces. And now it's out in the world. I'm going to see if I can flip through the images.
How do you feel about that, Andrea? How do you feel about it being out there?
It's interesting because it's red. It's Red Exit. It's this kind of potentiality of leaping from one space to another. I was thinking about the kind of irony of creating this stacked 10 landscapes, this kind of diaspora of images, while being kind of trapped in my apartment, right. Working on it. My studio had a COVID outbreak, and it was just, I didn't feel safe there, so I just worked on it primarily at home. I started it in New Orleans before the pandemic kicked up at the Joan Mitchell Center, and here it is installed at the Berkeley Gallery because I had to have it documented during quarantine as well. And the Berkeley Gallery in Minneapolis allowed for me to install it so we could have it properly documented for that. But it was definitely a difficult experiment to try to do such a monumental work from such a confined living space. But now I know I can do it. Now I feel like creating art could be much more, mobile. I could be painting this while on the road potentially.
That's amazing.
This type of work. But
there's like this idea of intimacy, right? When you're working on each of these panels, and then the translation from that intimacy to this monumental public access, right? The fact that it's installed on a busy street in New York City, right? How does that, kind of that threshold, how difficult or how amazing or I don't know, how do you interpret that kind of like that liminal space of you, your mind, this intimacy, and then, you know, the release of the work?
That's an excellent question, because when Melinda first contacted me about this opportunity, there was part of me that it just really appealed to be on the outside of the museum. In my activism work, I don't, I do a lot of activism about museum violence and about how museums are these problematic spaces that, you know, we as Native artists want to participate in and be part of. We want visibility. That within itself is a tactic for representation, for being seen, for not being invisible. So museums are all problematic spaces then, you know, so participating on the outside had an appeal to it. And it's also like that kind of go of us, of Native people, Indigenous people, finding these that, as you described, the liminal spaces that we offer up to our kin, to our relatives, to our to other Native people. And so this piece is a sister piece of Ink Babel, and it's a relative of a previous piece that was much more diasporic. I'll see if the next slide, I think. This is Ink Babel. It's you know, it's black and white. It doesn't have all the bright colors. And I had done this in 2014. And this was about stories kind of spreading out across the landscape. So I wanted to make a work that was much more celebratory of spaces that Native people not only reserve for ourselves, but we give each other access to, and that we really celebrate each other within. But it was kind of a foil to this piece, to Ink Babel, which was much more about stories spreading out across the landscape, but it's much more dystopic. It's much more desolate. Here's Ink Babel installed. And again, this is a piece that I did in 2014, and it took me a year and a half to finish. It's all ink and oil on paper. And it was so hard. I knew I wanted to do perhaps 4 of these pieces this size and all, but it took me years to approach that, because it's such an undertaking. And then the pandemic actually offered almost the perfect amount of isolation to just really focus in on it. And just to describe like how important, like how detailed, and how important it is to consider spaces that Native people have access to, which, you know, this is the opposite of. It's really important for me, you know, in the course of my career. I had gone from wanting to take the, as we often describe, the front door,
Yeah.
you know, into a museum or into an institution. We don't want to necessarily always be offered the side door, the back door, the doggy door. You know, sometimes we want to approach an institution and take those front doors into those spaces. But now, over the course of my career, I savor spaces that Native people reserve for each other, or Native people holding the door open for each other. I've really changed my perspective for wanting to celebrate other Native people. And it's not about the institutions or taking the front door. It's about what we do, you know, for each other. It's that relation. So I think that even from this piece to its sister,
Yeah.
my work has changed.
I love this detail.
This is a screen print with 20 layers to it. I couldn't do this. Well, I shouldn't say pull it off, because it's literally pulled. But this is this piece came out in 2018, so it was prior to Red Exit, and it was one of those seeds, one of the origin stories for Red Exit, or was this exit print. So along with Ink Babel, that was so incredibly huge. I knew the scale, and I knew that I wanted to relearn how to use color again. This piece taught me that, and then I was able to transition into doing a large piece again. but it has all of those elements. It has those bent trail markers. It has the trees that are bent to indicate trails, that were very popular prior to European settlement. And then there's those mica like talons and hands that are dug up all over the mounds and in Ohio.
It's so loaded. It's so loaded. Just looking at this image, there's so much to like unpack, especially from like a native perspective. I don't know if the audience is familiar with tree markers and like how native people augment the earth, to tell a story of our existence, of our paths in life, our prosperity and survival, which brings me to this exit. This is the very first appearance of the exit for you. Is that correct?
It is. And I remember looking, and I think it was just like a meme that you had created, but you had made this cave looking out and there's an exit sign on it. And I saw it and I had been working on this piece and I'd seen your image online and I was like, what is he, what are we both
in your mind,
on? Because I wasn't intentionally copying you.
Right.
Yours came out before mine, but I when I saw it, I was like, son of a bitch.
I remember you messaging me, DMing me like, what? We're thinking the same right now. And I was like, I didn't see the piece. I didn't see this work yet. I was like, wow. I mean, it makes sense, but thinking about this exit, thinking about this being the seed for the red exit. Can you explain that title? Let's start there and then we'll kind of zoom in. Let's start zoomed out with the title. What does that mean to you?
So I absolutely love poets and poetry. I haven't written much poetry, but poets are kind of my people. And there's this poet, he teaches in Michigan, named Gordon Henry. And I did one of his book covers for one of his books of poetry, but he has this poem that he has all of these like kind of names that you shouldn't call Indigenous people when writing Indigenous fiction.
Yeah.
And he had like running mascara and like all of these really kind of fun names, but one of them was Red Exit. And I often do look to poetry to steal the language of poetry to name my work. And so for some reason, Red Exit stuck. And, for him, it was something that should be avoided. And for me, it meant, like I was saying, those spaces that Natives reserve for, it's like actually exiting the museum, exiting institutions. And what do we cherish and hold dear? And I think that, I when I put it in this piece, I knew I wanted to return to it.
Wow.
But it's just this thing like if we could exit colonization. I know it's a total fantasy, but like it wouldn't be written in English even, but
yeah. It
sticks.
And then you have the man mound here. That's another very key moment in the red exit. And also telling the story of Anishinaabe, land. What is that? How does that? Why this? This parallel or this the man mound on the way out.
Well, so this particular piece, it was made in 2018. I left Minneapolis in 2016 and moved to Chicago, and it was really like the transition was very hard. And I drove on I-94 between Minneapolis, I-90 and I-94 between Minneapolis and Chicago, and made the trip so many times. My gallery that represents my work is still in Minneapolis. I have a huge community there, and so I still make the trip quite a bit. So every time I would stop off, and if you don't know anything about Wisconsin, effigy mounds, they're in the shape of animals and cranes and turtles and just these beautiful effigy mounds. Many of them were destroyed by the plow, settler plows. But So I stopped off and said hi to Man Mound. His legs, you know, of course, you know, because he's in your work as well, but his legs are, you know, kind of like dissected by a road. And then I don't know if the county painted white lines on the road to indicate his legs, and then and his feet, and that always seemed kind of like that painting of the road to repair him. Like that also seems like our efforts at decolonization or our efforts at repairing anything is it looks like white paint on a road to make up for destroying this beautiful effigy. So I inverted him. I wanted to restore his legs, not put the road in there. It's interesting, like when you paint something into a painting, you can make it whatever you want.
Yeah.
He was never. I say I don't know. It was actually a man. But you know, who knows? It's something that I think, you know, stopping off and seeing these effigies, you know, and then we can restore them in our artwork. I think that's a really, you know, you can end up almost maybe in this fantasy scape of landscapes or in this type of art, maybe we can even though we can't get into that landscape, we can't enter that 2D surface, maybe we can restore stuff even if it's just in our minds.
Nice. Restoration, reclamation, reconstruction, and here it is. Here's the red exit.
I may have messed up on the slides. Oh, sorry. We'll go here. I don't know what I'm doing.
Let's walk us through the complexity, the layers, and let's zoom in. Let's break this down for the public.
So the general idea of it, if you remember the ink babble pieces, it's kind of this, I don't know if this apex and vortex, this is more of an apex type, you know, repetition of imagery. If you were to take a panorama shot on celluloid film, the old celluloid film, and then take the film out of the camera and look at each cell, you'd have this cascading effect of imagery, and that's what your panorama, that would be the time between each cell that would represent the time it just imagery would take across. And then if you were to take a panorama photograph with still photography, you would just have a really long horizon line, like a typical panorama. So this is a bifurcated panorama. There are 10 stacked landscapes. There's time dominant panoramas that's going to be in your columns, and then your rows, you know, more horizontal, are going to be your space based panoramas or space dominant panoramas. So it's like a split apart panorama going in two directions. I wanted to play with dimensionality. I wanted to mess around with time and space and how would I do that on a 2D surface. But at its center, it has this infinity sign. It has the Métis sashes. The Métis people are the children of French fur traders and Cree or Ojibwe mothers. The difference between, like, say, my ancestors, that I have plenty of French ancestry, and the Métis people, is that the men stayed around and they, you know, formed this culture. They stuck around and took care of those families, and then they became a distinct people. So I always think of Métis people as like the ultimate survivors. On their flag, they have this infinity symbol, and it means we will be around forever. It's such a kind of a badass move. So I'm not Métis. I don't identify as Métis, but I when making this, I was thinking about Gerald Bisner's take on earth divers in the Ojibwe Atsokanag, which are these living, like, sacred stories. We have this recreation story of these various animals diving down to retrieve earth to recreate the earth on. So the muskrat in the Ojibwe version succeeds in bringing back mud that then the earth is recreated on. The the loon is also an earth diver. It's central to this piece. The loon fails in our version of the story. I say our version because I know that there's other Native nations, a lot of Anishinaabe nations that have variations on this particular story. But I was thinking of that perpetuity, not in memoriam. Natives are always kind of delegated to the past. And I love how the Métis with the infinity symbol, they're thinking perpetuity. That's a futurist act with their flag. The earth divers that retrieve the mud to recreate this is an investment into the future. So I really wanted this piece, Red Exit, to be this celebratory thing of Native spaces.
You're telling us a story about Tailfeather Woman.
Yeah.
How does that relate to this notion of futurity, perpetuity?
So just so people don't have to stare at that last slide. So Tailfeather Woman, I've lived most of my life in Minnesota before moving to Chicago 5 years ago. And I think that when people think of sovereignty, that's self-determination. When people think of a sovereign nation and they think about Native people, Indigenous nations, and the federal government, they think of that's where treaties live, is that relationship between Native nations and the federal government. But long before colonization, Natives have always made treaties with each other. There's always agreements. There's always peace being had, and there was also war. So the Ojibwe, and I'm Ojibwe, were in conflict with Dakota Native people in Minnesota for a long time. Those are the two primary nations, and Ho-Chunk as well, but the two primary nations in what is now Minnesota were Ojibwe and Dakota people. So a long time ago, after the War of 1862, the Dakota War of 1862, if you remember, Abraham Lincoln ordered the death of 38 Dakota men, simultaneously hung them. So in the aftermath of the war, the US military just kept picking on the Dakota people, kept murdering and hurting, and put the Dakota people in exile to various places outside of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. So Tailfeather Woman was up in North Dakota, and the cavalry came through and was killing her family and all of her loved ones, and she hid in a swamp for, some say 3, some say 4 days. And she, when the military was coming through, she would lay down under the surface of the water so she couldn't be seen, and stayed really still, and she would breathe through a reed. Some of the versions were, she just was in absolute agony in the swamp for that amount of time. But she had this out-of-body experience, maybe, or she had some kind of vision where a spirit came and approached her and walked her through the steps of making the big drum. And like, here's how you hollow out the tree, here's how you get barrel pieces, here is how you stretch the hide, and this is the size, and here's how you paint them, and taught her some dances. And so she was given such specific instructions for painting the big drum, or for making the big drum. So after the cavalry left, she came up out of the swamp, and she was also given instructions by the spirit to create the drum and give it to Ojibwe people. So she's Dakota, has been in conflict. Nations were in conflict and peace off and on. And the instructions of giving this big drum to the Ojibwe was to secure her safety and her people's safety, because that's the form of a treaty. We made treaties with each other through exchanging ceremonies. So she gave the big drum to Mille Lacs community up in Minnesota. And then from there, the big drum just took off as a cultural phenomena. And it's just the origin story of contemporary powwows. Yeah. And when you have like an origin story of the big drum, and it wasn't that terribly long ago, and that's where a lot of pan-Indian stuff comes in, a lot of what we call pan-Indianism. I don't know if that's the current word. Um, but that solidarity between a lot of different nations.
Right.
I think of that big drum and that it was a gift of a woman, and we know her name. Today, Native women aren't allowed to sit at the big drum at powwows.
Yep.
And when you think of that as the origin, it's absolutely, to me, I think that it's very disrespectful to that memory.
Yeah.
But I was thinking in terms of, it's an important story in terms of land and how Native people have related to each other historically, how it was through the gift. Could you imagine if the US had to sign treaties with Native people and Native people required something like a dance and making the, when you think of like the wampum treaties that had to be created, I think we should have probably made the US military dance.
This story reminds me of so many things, there's so many threads to this tapestry of displacement and removal, and Native people trying to interject, trying to wake each other up, right? Like the ghost dance, was brought up from the south, from the southern plains up to the Dakota and Lakota, and this phenomena is a very common theme. And it's like, I kind of feel like you're trying to do the same thing, through your work in a lot of ways. You're trying to bridge these notions of creation with our own kind of reeling with destruction, right? Here,
that's a great.
Yeah, go ahead.
The ghost dance in particular, I think that was, don't you think that was a futurist act? It was imagining we do this dance, we continue to do this dance, and then through that act, North America gets rolled up like a rug, gets shooken out. Yep. All of the European people get shot back to Europe. The rug gets rolled back out, and all the buffalo come back. All of the ancestors that were murdered come back. That was just like a beautiful vision through this dance. And it was also an act of futurism. It was like, this is what I want for the future and for my descendants. And it didn't work out.
It didn't work out in that moment. Yeah. But I think that it's, the ghost dance never ended. I think that these rebukes, these rejection of colonialism, is something that is perpetuated through works like the Red Exit, through these spaces that we create, that we imagine, that we make tangible. With that said, continue, walk us through these details and how that parallels.
So, I'll just show some more details. This one's a good one to talk about. So there's this lion that is, I took the image from this beaded medallion of the gold lion that is an award that is given out at the Venice Biennale. So a few artists, several years ago, my friend Nancy Marie Mythlow is a Native curator that has this Indigenous pavilion at the Venice Biennale. So when you think of the Biennale, you think of like these very nationalistic pavilions. This is the US pavilion, this is the Canadian pavilion, you think of the nation. So an Indigenous pavilion kind of takes, it kind of scratches the notion of that, of the imperialist pavilions, and then makes an Indigenous pavilion where she can curate almost as an agent that goes between the various Indigenous nations. Yeah. So this medallion was made as an award for the artist that she had invited to give to their Italian collaborator. But it was, I love the original because it's claiming that agency of being able to give the award, because Natives typically I don't think have gotten an award or don't typically get these accolades. So, but by reserving that, commissioning this medallion to be made, and then retaining the power to give it away, is is just such a cool, that's that reserving power for ourselves. And then I was thinking about the Golden Lion Award, and it's like, I would rather be in the Indigenous Pavilion because I had a few several years ago. Nancy had me in that exhibition. But not only would I rather be in the Indigenous Pavilion, I would rather, I like covet that medallion. That's what I want. I don't want the Golden Lion that the Biennale gives out. That medallion that you get from your peers, you know, it's like, and it's also like, who am I making this work for? I feel like I'm starting more and more to make work that I want to impress you. You know, I want to impress, you know, Deborah Yupapan, Chris Papan.
Yeah.
I want to impress Jim Denemy. Like these are this is who I guess my audience is. I thought about that. So yeah, I've been thinking about that more and more, I think, every year of how do we link arms and how do we come together? How do we you know, strengthen each other? So
I think that is crucial. That's such a crucial approach to this art world, you know, for our ability to carve that space out and create you know, moments that we celebrate ourselves, each other, and within and without the walls of these colonial institutions, these places that gatekeep, you know, fine art on this continent, on our continent, and try to exclude us and very sparsely include us, you know, that's crucial. And I think it's crucial to your work, you know, this disruption in institutional thinking, and this creation of a new platform and new vessels, you know, to celebrate our work and our thoughts. You know, you have all this work to unpack, right? And then you're also thinking, you know, in parallel of the creation of a Center for Native Futures. You're thinking in parallel of how the narrative of Indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism also link and you know, have to function in solidarity.
Yeah.
I want to interrupt your flow real quick just to read a quote from you. This is my introduction to you. You know, this is before I started to call myself an Indigenous futurist, before I even understood, you know, what that meant, what that movement meant. I heard it from you before Grace Dillon. And with that said, I want to read this quote to you and to everyone from this Mothership Connection, from this article you wrote. What does it mean to leave one world for the next, or to leave the present time for the future? There are many terms that characterize the movements of people: abduction, banishment, colonization, deportation, emigration, immigration, migration, exile, extraordinary rendition, pilgrimages, refugees, and settlers are a few words that qualify how people have come to occupy a place. Each word positions a person's sense of belonging to a place against the biases inherent to our terminology. It is political for any people to live in any land. The future, or the idea of the future, is an unoccupied space, or a space in theory only. One can imagine a future existence as hopeful, but the possibility of annihilation and absence loom in our imaginations from the conflict-saturated stories of history. You wrote that. And how, you know, tell us about these notions of futurity, Indigenous futurity, this piece, The Red Exit, and what's next? Because this is what number in the series? This is a series of four works, correct?
Yeah, eventually.
What are you thinking with each step, with each series?
I feel like the future of my work is I'm kind of, you know, I'm putting jigsaw pieces together for maybe when everything can come back together and be reintroduced to each other. But I do think that part of Indigenous futurisms needs to be this, you know, this imagining ourselves richly, this imagining our survivals. I'm imagining, that I think it was, it's and Scott Momaday, one of his quotes is that the greatest tragedy that can befall us is to go unimagined. And I kind of hold that in my mind when we are mascots, when we are portrayed in, various ways that we have had no say in, that is not imagining of who we are. That's not even unimagining of who we are. It is absolute harm. So it sets us back. So I think that we as artists have this ability to, be the futurists. And in particular, like with you and me and the artists that I had mentioned, there's a really cool thing that can happen in Chicago that maybe in the future, people look at this moment in Chicago as as a really amazing place where artists really developed this movement, really pushed the. At the same time, I think that things like Indigenous futurism might be might end up being our past. We always have to think on the fly.
Mhm.
So, but I think that as far as my work, I'm going to move into the third dimension. I have
Oh,
to
nice.
at some point.
I mean, I've seen some of your meddlings with projection in public space, and
Yeah.
I mean, I for all intents and purposes, I think you're already there. I think your infiltration of the public domain, is an extraction of all these thoughts, and it's an occupation of these spaces that would, typically exclude our narrative, and that's a dimension in itself. It's it's beyond this the two-dimensional representation. It's already you're already approaching that.
I'm going through some of these pretty quick because you're talking about infiltrations into spaces, into public spaces. So I'm looking at these, but I want to get to your because I want to get to the mounds. Sorry. If you guys want to see this original piece, you're going to have to go see at least the billboard. That'll get you closer. All right. Sorry.
We could talk about my work, I guess.
Yep.
Do you have questions about anything? I can just go in.
Yes, please go in.
Okay. Well, I mean, I want to start off with this image. I have 6 images. I want to start off with this work. It's my most recent work. It's called Flux Room. And for me, the aesthetic kind of like encapsulates kind of Andrea's use of color, and it's also two-dimensional in the formal sense. It's a projection on the wall, but the dimensionality is kind of morphed and encompassing through immersion. It's a 360 projection room. It's at the Wonder Museum, and I wanted to create a space that is kind of like this looming kind of like understanding that of post-humanity. That's something that we didn't really talk about, but it's in there. It's in your work. It's in a lot of Indigenous futurism, text and art and cinema. This notion of a post-human trajectory, and I really wanted to transport us into this space, this immersive 360 landscape piece, essentially. But it's a video work where the image is not stagnant and it morphs. It morphs into a landscape that you see the cityscape deteriorating. You see the forest burning. You start to smell within this room burning oil, burning gasoline, fire. You see the images morph and the colors change to regrowth and rebirth, and reclamation from the earth itself that is a world without us. So this idea is created with machine learning. So all the images are I help to kind of program this algorithm using images of indigenous land, images of decrepit cityscapes of industrial sites, and the algorithm kind of produced this cinematic experience. And I trained artificially intelligent music generator to look at the images and create a soundscape. So when you're there as a visitor, you're there as an onlooker with no input to this feedback loop. And it's a post-human world that looks familiar but doesn't exist. And it's called the Flux Room.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Now this, I've written on this piece.
Oh, that's right. This is Andrea used this word earlier, the return. When you're talking about the exit, and it's the same kind of thinking. It's the same kind of thinking. These white wall spaces, these gallery spaces, they kind of embrace this conventional redundant architecture of colonialism and capitalism. These corner conditions are something that trap us. And I was thinking about how can I pierce through that, embrace that corner condition, but superimpose this idea of nature, and create kind of like a portkey to the self. So it's called the return. And you see this looping projection map video of the sky, but you're really just looking into the corner, while this sound of my daughter, my 1-year-old daughter, reading a book in English, or attempting to, but all that comes out is this human baby babble, this baby speak. And no effort on my part to colonize her or assimilate her is working. That's the idea.
I really wish that I don't want children, but whenever I even in the video, the land acknowledgement at the beginning, that including your daughters, and then it's like they are our future. I know that's cliche, but I just love I love that they're making work with their dad. I think that's super amazing.
Like, it's a necessity. It's a necessity at this point. There's such a part of my life that they make all this work come out, and I try to involve them, and I even involve them in this work, Sovereign. My daughter is with me harvesting this non-native invasive grass, that suffocates the indigenous restoration sites here in Chicago. So we're harvesting these invasive grasses from the city streets. We harvested this grass along the Indian boundary line in the city of Chicago, where there's a mental hospital, where they also keep children that were caught at the border before deportation. There's a lot of complexity to the story of the city grid and these colonially built spaces. And I wanted to create a glitch in that program, and where the glitch is actually kind of that loophole in the system, and create a very sacred space called Sovereign. This, Andrea, you got to see this, right?
Yep.
Yeah. This is another the next step to that hut you saw, the traditional silhouette of the palmetto hut for the Koasati people, but also very similar to the wigwam here in this land. The materiality changes and morphs, right? But there's a lot of universality in our practice, in our building practices. And this is at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and I wanted to create a reset. This is called Ayel Tikba, the fire inside, where we set that hut, we set that non-native grass on fire continually throughout the biennial, and we set it on top of a earthen platform mound. And the idea is, to occupy these colonial spaces and remind them, of the civilizations that existed before, the foundations that these cities are built upon, and that we can build on top of again. So it's a seed for futurism through the architectural lens, and it's kind of like a warning shot that we're going to build our cities again.
Oh, I love this. This is where I was we should have started with this on your slides about, I've started doing projection and getting out of doors for my work, but this is very special piece in Chicago.
this Andrea was actually helped me build this. We had a shaping day. We were shaping the mounds right before they started to put the erosion blankets on and seed it. And Andrea was there. She gifted me some sweet grass, and I still have that. And she was there on this day too. This is where we. It's a ceremonial documentation of this mound called Pokto Chinto, Serpent Twin Mound. Technically, I guess it's the first effigy mound, built in the United States since colonialism, right? There are lots of other mound typologies that have been constructed, but the effigy mound, the symbology of the serpent weaving in and out of the earth around us, reminding us about this perpetuity of existence, is something that's being celebrated here.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, this is the one that is behind Andrea. This is the coiled serpent, Filolakachin Chinto in my language. This is going to be the newest, latest, and greatest effigy earthwork in the city of Chicago. Recently just awarded by the city a DCASE award. So we're fully funded to construct this year. Thank God. It's been a 3-year kind of a wait, see if we can raise the funds. Building these effigy works, building these earthworks in today's climate with all the red tape and we can't just push earth on the same site, and create something within the city. There's Army Corps of Engineers, there's city parks, there's all these jurisdictions and all these stakeholders now. So the creation of a work like this often becomes a performative piece, not for me, but for the city and for everyone outside of the Native community to make it happen. And the fact that it is happening, is kind of an awakening that's happening. And the fact that Red Exit, is embraced by the Whitney and in their collections, these moments of embracing our work is seminal. It's an important beginning for us, and I think it's an important exit for our survival into our prosperity.
Well, it's something that you said to me a while back, where you're like, we need these institutions to perform for us. So when you call it, it's a performative piece that all of these, maybe non-natives participate in. I think that that's a really interesting perspective of like we're typically in these subservient positions, but it's just like, let's make them dance for us. Contemporary treaty making, you're dancing for us.
The ghost dance never ended, Andrea. It's different. Right? It's a different dance. They're dancing for us now, right?
I love it.
Yeah, X, I was going to just say, maybe on that note, I'm happy to perform for you both right now. Yeah. That's why I'm here, and it's my honor to be doing that. If you don't mind, I was thinking we could take some questions from the audience, and I selfishly have some questions, but I first want to say it's so amazing to listen to both of you talk about your practices, and I knew there would be a lot to cover, and I really wish we had a full day symposium. If I could, it'd probably be torture to you guys, but I would love that, to just listen to you all day. And there's, as Santiago X was saying, there's so much to unpack in your work, Andrea, and we're just touching the surface on both of your practices, really, and so many amazing topics. So I'll jump in with a question that's on my mind, and I think on the audience's mind. We were hovering on some images that sort of brought this kind of up, I think, in the Q&A. You both, I was thinking about this today, have thought quite a bit about kind of larger questions around environmental crises and apocalyptic environmental disaster as it relates to your works in different ways, really so many different ways. And I'm thinking about cycles of recreation that we've talked about in your work, Andrea. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how environmental concerns intersect with both of your practices. And then Andrea, the bat motif in your work, we got some questions from the audience about that image specifically, and I was thinking kind of more about how that relates to your interest in thinking around the relationship to land and to this threat of extinction.
Well, I think that I think that for a lot of, and I don't want to, be the uh, therapist or to make any grand statements about how Native people feel or think, but I think that at least personally and with a lot of my peer group, sometimes there is this fear amongst Native people of losing our languages and losing our, and I think that from that place or that dread or whatever that thing is about because we've lost so much land. But I think that how X is describing, the ghost dance didn't end. It's transformed. We don't have to, but I think that it's important to think about maybe circumventing the finality of colonization and settler futurity. Like we need to foreclose on settler futurity. We need to figure out how to do that. So I think maybe in terms of transformation or in terms of like these things are not, that there is continuity, and we don't exist in the past and we don't exist in the future, but we're stringing along continuity. There's so many things that kind of work to break that up in people's minds. If I had $1 for every time somebody, like would say to me, oh, well, authentic natives lived in the past and you're no longer a part of that. If I had $1 for every time, people equated Native people to the past. I think that through work like X's and my own and poetry of Hyder and people that are learning the languages and are steadfast in these practices, they really have nothing. Learning your language is important, and you don't have to do it by centering the settler either. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, as colonization can just mean healing for Indigenous people, and it can mean refusal of some of these colonial tactics.
Yeah, I want to add that, these notions of environmentalism, being kind of like, it's intrinsic to our understanding and our being as Indigenous people to be of the land and in perpetuity, which brings us to like the video acknowledgement. I didn't want to call it land acknowledgement. I didn't want to put Andrea on the spot of what she's doing is she's acknowledging the people. She's acknowledging this idea of origin. She's acknowledging the land, water, sky, and the people. It's not a singular narrative of land. It's not a singular narrative of ownership and stake. There's people, from these different spots on the continent, on a rotating Earth, rotating a dying star in a cosmos with a billion stars, over a billion stars. And the idea of acknowledging one parcel of land seems insignificant. Through the lens of futurity and Indigenous understanding that we have always been, from time immemorial, a part of this system and will always be, even when the looming threat of humanity reaching its brink and the post-Anthropocene being introduced to this earth, and we don't have a sequel, but the earth keeps spinning. All these complexities and layers are part of our work and are part of our thoughts and a part of our understanding of trying to keep our language alive, our culture, our connection, this one-to-one relationship with where we come from, even when we were removed from that place. And the reclamation and reconstruction of these places and that connection. That's what we're doing actively.
You both have just kind of covered some other answers through your answer, kind of covered other questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So thank you for that. In a way, someone had asked, maybe more about how both of you are sort of taking on the kind of political and talking about the political and existential aspects of Indigenous artists taking on and occupying or interpreting public space as demarcated by the state. And this person mentioned that, that seems like a really powerful but potentially difficult act to take on. Would you want to add anything to that question or comment, I guess?
I mean, it's a very important context, like sometimes people are like, why would you work with these terrible museums that have, all of the ancestors, in boxes in their storage, or why would you work with this person or that person? And it's like, well, but if I'm going to get in there, if I'm going to get into the fortress, I can do better work not better work, but I can be in there and antagonistic. I'm in the mouth, I'm the throbbing tooth in the mouth. Maybe that's a good vantage point to disrupt. But that doesn't mean that those that are on the outside of the fortress and that, Fred Moten, the political surround, can't also pick at it. I love I not love, but I appreciate many tactics when it comes to colonization through institutions. So yeah, but public space, you can't veto it. It's in your face. That's why, like, the Columbus statue is just so, like, you can't not see it. It's in your space. So when I put my work in, I want it to be temporary. I don't want people to have to live around my work forever. I want, and then so.
It's a difficult space to operate. The fact that we have all this weight on our shoulders to, all this necessity to infiltrate, disrupt, usurp, invert, whatever, that it has to be part of our practice. It's a lot. It's a lot of labor. It's a lot of pain. It's like, where does the pain end? Where does the beauty begin? That's the idea that we're trying to figure out. That's that threshold that we're trying to create from. Often it weaves in and out. Sometimes we find the beauty. Sometimes it's all pain. But we have to grapple with that. All of us Indigenous people, not just artists. Where can we enjoy this place? Where can we enjoy this land that constantly is trying to remove us? As we sit here speaking English, when we really want to be speaking in our native languages, that liminal space, of our existence, of all these things that are corralling us and cornering us into responding and prodding us. I think also we're more powerful in our presence than we are in our absence. So when we're not here, you're not hearing this. We're not. There's no catharsis. There's no understanding. But when we are here talking to you and you're listening, we're doing something. Just our presence, just our existence is a form of resistance. But that's the modalities that we have to operate within, the confines, and that's, we dream of a space where we don't have to decolonize everything. To be honest, that's what we want. We want spaces that are ours, that we don't have to disrupt, that we don't have to go through this song and dance to be seen and tell our story. We just want to have the joy. We just want to have the beauty. We don't want the pain. But until then, that's where we're at, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those two, I think listening to X makes me think so much about what Red Exit, Andrea's work is about, like that, finding that space. And also right now, recognizing that there isn't a space that is just joyful and is just hopeful. It comes with this these realities and the kind of the current moment that we're in. Great background. So there is that kind of I don't want to say duality, but there's a relationship between the two, which Andrea, you've talked about so well, like describing that relationship between celebration and still being amidst this current reality, ongoing reality of assimilation, of kind of a attempted removal. So that it's interesting that it's really, I think that your motifs, we're getting a lot of questions about like specific motifs in your work, and you don't have to reveal all the stories. I know we'd be here for days, which I would love. But since you can't kind of go into the backstory on each motif, I was just thinking about how in many ways, so many of those motifs connect to a story, and you've told some of them tonight, so I think the audience has gotten a sense of that, but have told stories that are invoking or really like about advocacy, resistance. X says the word you just used, of course, resistance, and that kind of how critical that is, and it really, yeah, if there's anything you want to add to that in terms of we're getting a lot of questions about your imagery and kind of where you're pulling it from, and it's sort of hard to say that concisely, because in both of you work in a way where you're drawing on like from a lens of that's historical, mythological, from a contemporary community of artists and thinkers. There's so much really to say.
Yeah, I think that I've started almost writing, and I hate to do this because, artists just want to put their stuff out in the world and just hide behind the curtain. But sometimes I've started work, I will write pieces on my own artwork. And so I have this kind of long list, which turns into like a codex, like where I'm very, this means this, and this means this, and this references this. And I think that that's a good communication tool for people to understand some of these things. That's not like I can show X an image of Man Mound and he gets it immediately, but he knows where it's at. He's made art on it, but I don't have the privilege of necessarily using some indigenous iconography or visual lexicon in my work and just having people get it immediately. That's just not the luxury that I have. So I've become a writer, for other artists, other Native artists to write on their work, because my work wasn't being written on, and I wasn't having shows reviewed, and I was like, well, I can do that. I can pick that up and do that for other people. But I do think that it's something that, I do for my own work as well. Just because it's one thing to, pump images at a person. It's another thing to take time to say, well, these are the things that you would need to Google. These are the things you would need to research, but take on those stories with caution. If you learn something from me, don't appropriate it. It doesn't, sometimes when you tell a story, you're burdening that person with that story to carry it and care for it. And so when I write about my own work, I get very cautious about what I reveal, just because I don't want, or I want to warn people that it doesn't necessarily fully belong to them. They're caring for it. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and I'll do it. I'll write on it.
I think that's so generous of you, Andrea, to like give people that kind of deciphering, kind of access. But like Andrea said, you're not going to know everything. We're not going to tell you everything. There's a lot that we're never going to tell you about our work and about our ancestral understandings of the work. And it's so much more. It's so much more than we're presenting. And for you to understand that level, you have to connect with Indigenous people, their communities. You have to be a part of that land and a part of those people to get that access. There's a lot of things you don't know. It's just part of it's part of the process. We're not going to tell you everything.
X, I'm glad you made that distinction, because I think in Andrew's work and in your work, it's, as you're saying, viewers shouldn't come with this expectation to decode, or that you would have this, Andrew and I have talked about this a lot, like that you would never provide like an index or encyclopedia. It's not your burden to educate or to provide that. I think that's up to the viewer, but also for the artist to share what kind of create the space that they want, and not everything needs to be accessible in that way. I think that's important. And but we'll look forward to reading any future writing on Red Exit, Andrea. No pressure. It is always, I find it to be really special to be reading directly from you as the artist, and that's not always the case, of course. And I think kind of especially with your work, it's so crucial to be having your voice be present and amplified in relation to your work. So I think we are kind of, I know we're going over a bit after 7 p.m. And so I think we could kind of wrap up. One question I had relates again to some of the use of stories and narratives. Andrea, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the recreation story and the loon, which is such a central motif at the bottom of your piece. If you could say more about the Ojibwe recreation narrative, I think that would be kind of interesting. I love hearing you talk about the earth divers.
So the loon is one of the earth divers when the world is well, when I guess North America was recreated. You know, some people refer to the earth divers as the creation narrative, but in Ojibwe culture, it's our recreation story after the earth is flooded due to revenge among spirits. The various animals dive down to retrieve some earth to regrow North America on, and the muskrat succeeds. And we have a muskrat clan that is very compassionate to this day, and they're amazing survivors. And we even today give the amount of tobacco we give each other is the size of a muskrat paw, which is a reference to that recreation story. The loon fails in retrieving, dives really deep, and is unable to bring back any mud, so comes back and fails and is restored. But about the loon, it's also a clan, a very important clan. Their orders, they're really important in Ojibwe culture. They have a migas shell necklace, and migases are cowrie shells. And the Ojibwe also have this story of our great migration story to what is now Minnesota and Manitoba and various places in the Midwest from the East Coast. And it was that we followed a migas shell, a cowrie shell. So I put a cowrie shell also in this like, you know, to reference our migration. And it also has like kind of scratched on the surface the Lord's Prayer. And it's this grafting of narratives on another narrative. When I say flood story, when I say recreation story, people are constantly overwriting it with Christianity. So I put that Lord's Prayer, and then the Lord's Prayer is also like a narrative of futurity. It's, you know, forever and ever, amen. It's so I kind of maimed it in a way, I guess, but I won't philosophize on that too much.
X, is there anything you want to add?
No, I like ending on those. That's a good note to end on regarding that.
Agreed.
Lord's Prayer.
Well, with that, I guess we will wrap things up. We don't have to have it actually be the end note, since that was not really the intention.
Does someone want to lead us in prayer?
I was thinking, Andrea, the other day, kind of somewhat optimistically, but knowing that it's not, full optimism, let's say, that I was thinking about what you said to me about the earth divers and like this moment in time, and that, hopefully you had said, I think, hopefully we're in an era of earth divers again. Yep. And I really love that sentiment.
Oh, I do too. Thank you for remembering that.
Always and forever. Yeah. So maybe we can wrap up there. I don't want to have the last word though, so that's what's hard. But I want to thank both of you from the bottom of my heart, because I'm such admirers of both of your practices, and so happy you could both be here. So thank you for taking time to talk to us, and thank you to our audience for the great questions and for being here.
Yep, thank you. Miigwech, chimiigwech.
Masitu, alilamo.